So this is important to point out. People sometimes ask, hey, what's the difference between disabled attribute and read-only attribute? The difference is that disabled, it's not submitted or editable, but with read-only, it is submitted, but it's not editable. An example of read-only might be the username field when you're editing your profile in WordPress. You're not really allowed to change your username once it's set, but they want you to be able to see it. So they could either disable it or they could offer read-only and not allow them to edit it. What I want to point out, though, is that this is JavaScript. So I'm going to show you later how you could customize this or edit it on an existing field using JavaScript, which means that you can now edit the field, and we'll look at some of the potential issues with that, and a reminder later that you just always want to have some server-side validation so that if somebody disables or tweaks stuff with JavaScript on the front end, you always have a backup that they can't mess with on the back end. So finally, we come down to our newsletter here. This is just to show you an example of a checkbox, really only because with JavaScript, we could also set checked equal to true later on. You could also hard code it in here. Notice, though, the same thing, though, that we saw before. This is sometimes a common mistake. You'll have for equals newsletter, but notice there's no ID here called newsletter. So if we start clicking on this label, it does nothing. But if we come down and say, okay, our ID for this is going to be newsletter, then that syncs the two of these up, right? And then the value, we could customize this, and it would say sign up. So it doesn't have to be just a checkbox value. You could customize what that is going to say. But on the back end, you'll notice that we have to say name, so you would get newsletter and then value equal to yes. So those two will make sense together. Just remove that for the demo purposes. And now we come down to the last little component here that I want to talk about. Again, you're getting a full download on HTML forms, which you might not have expected, but it is important to understand this stuff. And so we have our input fields, and we have a few types that relate to buttons like we see here. We have the reset and we have submit. And both of these have default actions. If we click reset, like I showed you before, it will reset all of the fields. That's gone. Likewise, if I fill in my email and I hit submit, it's going to submit that form and go back to the beginning. We also have a third type, and I'll come down here, and that's the input type of button. Now, most of the time, if you have a button and you click on it, it won't do anything. This form is not being submitted. So this means that we could completely customize it with JavaScript later on, and sometimes you just want a button that you don't want to do anything with, like you don't want it submitting your form, you just want a random button that you could do something with in JavaScript, and we'll find these really helpful. Now the confusing thing, though, is that we have input with a type of button, but we also have a button. And we have button with a type of button, but we also have button with a type of submit. So if I refresh this now and I click on my button here, it's going to submit my form. Now it's not submitting the form up here, it's submitting this form down here, which actually isn't really doing anything. We don't have too much data being passed. We actually have nothing being passed. But I bring this up because I want to show you the difference between buttons and input buttons. The difference is that when we have an input field and we want to give it a value, we have to set the value attribute. However, button is an HTML element that has an opening and a closing tag, which means that it can accept content in between it. In this case, we have a little help icon. Notice if we come down here, we've got this little help icon, nice. But when we click on it, it doesn't do anything. If we were to change this to type submit, then it would submit the form. But not only can we use images, we can use text. Now, of course, you can also put text as a value for an input type. However, you cannot put text and an image, but you could put text and then use CSS to add this in the background. So that's possible. So you could sort of make a button that looks like this. Again, this isn't super styled. I'll take this out. But the major difference, and really the only difference, is that the button type can accept any sort of content between the opening and closing tags, whereas the input field is only going to be able to accept text as the value attribute value. And if you wanted to put images and stuff like that, it would have to be done via CSS. The other thing is that button, if you leave off the type, so if I were to take this type attribute out and I come back to my form, notice that when I click on it, it submits the form. So it's always a good idea when you're working with buttons to hard code and be very specific what type of button you want, because you may actually see differences in how different browsers work with different buttons. And again, the last point here is just that these two are very similar. You've got the button element, the input element with type equal to button, and the only difference is going to be that one can have value or content in between the opening and closing tags. So I know that this has been a long HTML introduction or review for you potentially for working with forms, but it's important because in the next video, part 2 of this, we're going to continue with getting and setting form values, but I think it's important that we really understand the HTML and all the different attribute possibilities behind the scenes before we get into that. So if you haven't played with forms, I suggest you try building one of your own. Play with these different types, experiment, get a little practice. And once you've done that, or if you've worked with forms a lot, then let's just skip to the next video where we'll look at the JavaScript and DOM aspects of how to get and set these values.